Yo, I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. So even though the Assad regime has agreed to give up its chemical weapons arsenal, Obama and his team of warmongers continue to inch closer to igniting a powder keg in Syria. As a result, a 2000 speech from then State Senator Obama has started to attract attention. Now, his campaign website posted a video in 2007 to highlight his fierce opposition to military intervention during the run-up to the Iraq War. Conveniently, only 13 seconds of the original 2002 speech exists online. Take a listen.
I don't oppose war in all circumstances, and when I look out over this crowd today, I know there is no shortage of patriots or patriotism. What I do oppose is a dumb war.
Interestingly, only a transcript remains for the rest of the speech, and it's not hard to see why the Obama PR machine isn't keen on making this particular video viral. Here's what Obama goes on to say about former Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein, except I've replaced two words, Assad for Saddam and Syria for Iraq. Quote, he has repeatedly defied UN resolutions, thwarted UN inspection teams, developed chemical and biological weapons, but I also know that Assad poses no imminent and direct threat to the U.S. I know that an invasion of Syria, without a clear rationale and without strong international support, will only fan the flames of the Middle East and encourage the worst rather than the best impulses of the Arab world. I could not have said it better myself, State Senator Obama. You know, you should really sit down and talk to the president. Since 9/11, the surveillance and police state in the U.S. have exploded, all justified by the ubiquitous threat of terrorism. Yes, folks, this massive industry is banking on your fear. An illogical fear, considering how Americans are more likely to die from falling furniture or suffocating in their sleep than from a terrorist attack. Yet, despite this statistical improbability, this enormous growth has continued unabated, accompanied by a corporate takeover of industries that profit off fear and war. Look, it's no secret that many government officials have close ties to corporate America. Sometimes they're so intertwined, it's kind of hard to tell them apart. According to Alternet, 70% of the national intelligence budget is now spent on private contractors. And there are at least 1,931 firms across the country dedicated to fighting terrorism. And when it comes to the surveillance state, some of the politicians fear-mongering the most have the most personal of stakes in keeping us the most terrified, like Michael Hayden, former director of the National Security Agency. Since the NSA leaks, Hayden's been parading the media circuit to continue scaring Americans, yet never once disclosing that he actually has a financial stake in doing so. See, Hayden works for a private firm called the Chertoff Group, run by none other than Michael Chertoff, the former head of the Department of Homeland Security. How it all fits together. Yet another bloated government agency created in the wake of 9/11. The goal of the Chertoff Group is to help companies amp up their security and devise strategies that will help them win government contracts. For example, as former head of the DHS, Chertoff sold the idea of airport body scanners across the country, a product his own company produced. $118 million later, cha-ching! America's airports are invading your privacy one scan at a time. But the Chertoff Group isn't working alone. The Science Applications International Corporation, better known as SAIC, call themselves experts when it comes to counterterrorism. Essentially, they're just another defense contractor. And with over 42,000 employees, this company is making a pretty penny off the Keeping America Safe business model. In fact, their net income last year was $525 million. And speaking of defense contractors, who can forget that little company that Edward Snowden brought into the spotlight? Booz Allen. Basically, when the government wants to collect intelligence but doesn't have the manpower, they outsource to Booz Allen. And really, is it any surprise, considering how its VP used to work in national intelligence? Yes, revolving door strategy is definitely key in the defense business. It's a strategy that's landed the corporation $1.3 billion just off government intelligence work over the last year. And guess what? Despite the NSA scandal, the DoD just set up another contract with Booz worth $5.6 billion. But in the post-9/11 world where everyone's a suspect, apparently local law enforcement needs to be just as vigilant as the feds. And that's where Security Solutions International comes in. These guys are all about teaching cops about Muslims and Islam. In fact, the corporation has trained over 700 law enforcement agencies over the past 9 years, often holding workshops outlining how Islam is synonymous with terrorism. And if you can't afford the $400 to attend one of these forums, don't worry. Just pay the $35 a year subscription fee to Counter Terrorist Magazine. And like Security Solutions International, the Center for Counterintelligence and Security Studies makes its money from teaching classes on Islamic practices to police. Under the guise of national security, of course. And these classes appear to be a case of full-blown Islamophobia. The company claims it, quote, posits radical Islam as a new global ideological menace on the order of the old communist threat from the Soviet Union. And while it might seem far-fetched to link Islam to the Cold War, the idea is turning quite a profit for this firm. A 5-day course for government employees runs about $39,000. Too much? Well, you can always do a mini course for about $23,000. Or opt for the individual classes. Those only cost around $7,000 a pop. Remember, guys, taxpayers pay the salaries of police, which means we are paying for the training of an already heavily militarized police force, which is exactly my point. Every day, our economy seems to be running more and more on fear and war. For what? So that these companies can sell us back our own peace of mind against an invisible threat that they've created? Look, the question we should be asking here isn't just whether we're overpaying for national security. It's what exactly is our national security even protecting us from? Every empire throughout the course of human history has shared a similar trait, generating fear by scapegoating a certain segment of its population to maintain the status quo. The U.S. is replete with examples of this type of exclusion and generalized accusations against a specific group. In the 1940s, it was the Japanese who were dehumanized. Japanese Americans were forced into internment camps and stripped of their freedoms. Then it was the communists. During the Cold War, Senator McCarthy led a witch hunt against anyone and everyone who he deemed a communist. Today, even 12 years after the 9/11 attacks, Muslim Americans continue to experience this type of prejudice. So is the phenomenon of Islamophobia an essential tool to perpetuate the war on terror? Here to help me break down this issue from a historical perspective, I'm joined by Deepa Kumar, professor of media studies at Rutgers University and author of the book Islamophobia and the Politics of Empire. Thank you so much for coming on, Deepa.
Thank you for having me, Abby.
So in your book, you mentioned the idea of the, quote, Muslim enemy, dating back to the 11th century and the Crusades. How does Islamophobia today fit into that historical narrative?
Well, the argument that I make in the book, as you just said, is that empires always need an enemy, and they need to generate fear and hatred in order to justify their actions around the world. So back in the 11th century, when the Pope actually launched the Crusades, it was not, even this first Holy War wasn't really about, religion. It was about extending the power of the papacy, of the Vatican, over a united Christian Europe, and extending its influence into the Middle East, into the Byzantine Empire. Today, after the events of 9/11, we have similarly seen the elevation of this idea of an Islamic terrorist who's everywhere around the world and against whom there must be an endless war on terror that gets waged. And as you said earlier, this has been the justification for the growth of a national security state. There was some limits put on the national security state back in the 1970s with the Church Committee and Pike Committee reports. But since 9/11, of course, this has all arisen once again in order to supposedly protect us against the Islamic terrorist who's everywhere.
But when is this going to not work anymore, Deepa? Because it's been more than 12 years since 9/11. The threat clearly is nil. Still, as so much of national policy is fueled by Islamophobia. I mean, why? Why does this continue to be the case?
Right. Well, let's throw a statistic out there in terms of how non-existent this threat actually is. The sociologist Charles Kurzman actually did a study, and in the 10 years since 9/11, of the 150,000 murders that have taken place, Muslim Americans are responsible for about 33. More Americans die from drowning in their bathtubs, as another sociologist put it, than related to terrorism the world over, right? So the question then is, why why is this important in order to, carry out certain policies? Well, think about it. Back during the Cold War, as you mentioned, there were these drills called duck and cover, where kids were asked to hide underneath their desk and cover their heads in preparation for a nuclear attack against this country. Now, of course, that's a ridiculous way to protect yourself, right, against a nuclear attack. But what's the point of this? The point is to keep people scared, so we never question the trillions of dollars that are spent advancing U.S. interests around the world. And by the way, these are not the interests of ordinary people. These are the interests of the oil barons. These are the interests of the political class that is interested, particularly in the Middle East, in maintaining this idea of a Muslim enemy so as to control the oil resources in that region.
Well, you just broke it down pretty lucidly, Diba, and I think a lot of people realize that too. And my question, I guess, is why are police so susceptible to Islamophobia? Because, last month, last month's news that the NYPD had labeled mosques terrorist organizations. I mean, what is going on here? Do they just buy into it?
Well, there are, I'm sure, sections of the police who actually buy into it because, as you mentioned earlier, there are people in this well-funded far right-wing Islamophobic network who work for the centers that you mentioned earlier, who instruct people. So the Third Jihad was this documentary film that was shown in a continuous loop to NYPD police officers. So to some extent, they probably believe this kind of thing. It's hard to generalize to everyone. But what this particular designation was about is really doing an end run around the Constitution. When you name a mosque a terrorist institution, then you can go in and violate people's right to religion, people's right to free speech and so on, because, hey, they're terrorists, so we can do this. But, that's not all. Today, this morning, there was an excellent story in The Nation by sports writer David Zirin about, not just mosques and community organizations and, student groups across the Northeast being infiltrated and spied upon by the NYPD, but sports activities. The NYPD set up these soccer leagues and a cricket cup. And guess who came to it? It was South Asians, it was Arabs, and so on. And it became a source for monitoring people and recording what they were doing. I mean, this is what this country has become today.
You're right. It's definitely unfair to say that they're susceptible to Islamophobia. I mean, they probably are just using it as a tool to just blanketly spy warrantless, erosion of civil liberties here. It's almost giving them too much credit. Islamophobia, to an extent, is something kind of many on the left tend to associate with conservatism. But really, this type of demonization is fairly nonpartisan. As you point out, you've talked about something called the liberal Islamophobia. Can you expand on what that is?
Yes. I mean, basically, if you understand Islamophobia as not simply being restricted to hate crimes or the idea of conservatives, the racist ideas of conservatives, but instead you trace it to the roots of who is responsible for projecting this notion of an Arab terrorist first and then the Islamic terrorist, you have to go back to about the late 1970s and the 1980s in this country when this image first comes into being. A theory is put out that there is an international conspiracy led by the Soviet Union of terrorists who are bent on destroying the West. And of course, you fast forward to 2011, this conspiracy has come true, isn't it? The world is full of these sorts of people. And so what you have is both Democrats and Republicans being part of this process. Let's not forget, under Clinton, you have strikes against Sudan, for instance, and Afghanistan in retaliation for the embassy bombings in Tanzania and Kenya. And that sets the precedent of militarily striking. Of course, Reagan had also done that in Libya, but it sets the precedent that should violence, political violence, be used, then the U.S. has a right to go off and make war. And this is a bipartisan project. Both Democrats and Republicans do this. And however...
And also, I'm so sorry to interrupt, we're out of time, but of course the corporate media is a central tool in this as well. Diba Kumar, really appreciate you coming on, professor and author, Rutgers University.
Thank you.
Still ahead, I'll be talking to author Kevin Ryan about some alternative explanations that challenge the official narrative we've all heard about 9/11. Stick around. For many, the crimes of September 11, 2001 have been investigated and the case closed. The conclusion? 19 Arab hijackers led by Osama bin Laden successfully carried out the terrorist attacks by catching a $1 trillion defense industry completely off guard. However, millions of people around the world say that there are many questions left unanswered about what really happened that day and why. But because most of the evidence has been destroyed, independent investigators have taken the initiative to piece together the facts themselves. One of them being Kevin Ryan. He's the co-editor of the Journal of 9/11 Studies and author of Another 19, a book examining 19 alternative suspects that he alleges has the real means, motive, and ability to pull off the 9/11 attacks. I spoke to him earlier and first asked him why he decided to write this book. Check it out.
Well, because 9/11 was the origin of the war on terror, which has caused such devastation around the world. And the official reports are known to be false. The 9/11 Commission report did not answer a majority of the questions that were posed to it. And the NIST World Trade Center report is unscientific and false. So we need to know what happened on 9/11, and we can't depend on the government to tell us.
Well, Kevin, the official narrative, of course, fed to the American people about this tragedy is that 19 hijackers led from a man in a cave acted pretty much completely alone to attack the U.S. You allege that this is not the case, and in fact that there is an extraordinary amount of evidence that points to other players involved. Who are the other 19?
Well, these men were business leaders, military and intelligence leaders, government representatives in the United States. They're from the CIA, the FBI, the Secret Service, NORAD, and private companies like the Carlyle Group and SAIC. Some of them have a history of covert operative experience, and others appear to have worked for what seemed to be a private intelligence network. But basically all of them are suspicious in that they were in perfect position to make 9/11 happen in just the way that it did.
Kevin, when people hear this kind of information, many times they'll ask, well, if members of the U.S. government or government insiders or business affiliates allowed or even worked to ensure that 9/11 did happen, why? What was to gain for these people from 9/11 taking place?
Well, there were many benefits. Obviously, the seizure of natural resources in countries like Iraq, which has the world's second largest reserves of oil, and Afghanistan, which has natural gas and other mineral resources. Really, the fact is that in our day and age, whoever controls Eurasia controls the world. So it does appear that the war on terror driven by 9/11 was motivated by seizure of the Eurasian resources, and that's what we've seen happen since then.
Well, we certainly have seen that happen, Kevin, and I think a lot of people know, of course, the household names Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, Bush. Obviously, those are the names as the main neocon propagandists selling that premise of the whole agenda that's been put in place since 9/11. I wanted instead for you to focus on a couple lesser-known people, one who you talk about in your book, Paul Bremer. Who is Paul Bremer, and how does he tie into what happened on 9/11?
Well, Bremer is most well known for having been the Iraq occupation governor after the U.S. invasion in 2003. He was selected for that job by Donald Rumsfeld, and he made a lot of very terrible decisions that would not make a lot of sense for someone who's trying to help the country. For example, disbanding the Iraqi army and so forth. But Bremer has many other very interesting features about his history. He was a longtime assistant to Henry Kissinger, who was selected by Bush to lead the 9/11 Commission originally. He was also a terror propagandist throughout the 1990s. He led a lot of commissions, U.S. commissions that worked to transfer out of Soviet military or terrorist attacks into a threat of Islamic terrorism. Unfortunately, none of these commissions were able to report the incidents that had already been revealed that were known as Operation Gladio, Operation Northwoods, and the Gulf of Tonkin event, which were state-sponsored plans. So what's most important about Bremer is on 9/11, he just happened to be at the World Trade Center as an executive for a company called Marsh & McLennan, and that was just for a short period of time for him. He was there, but he was not killed. Instead, he spent the day on television telling us what happened and who we needed to attack because of it. One other thing I would say about Bremer is that he was a director for a company that had patented a thermite demolition device.
So on the morning of 9/11, instead of serving in the Marsh & McLennan, he's there kind of selling the bin Laden narrative before even the facts were really laid out, Kevin. It's pretty interesting. Kevin, what about Dwayne Andrews? Who's that?
Well, Dwayne Andrews was the longtime protege of Dick Cheney. Andrews said that Cheney was his lifelong hero. But what's interesting about Andrews is that he led a company called Science Applications International Corporation, or SAIC, for the 8 years before 9/11. And this company has so many important links to 9/11, it's really astounding. They created the national databases that identified and tracked alleged terrorists. They provided terrorism screening equipment to the airports in the United States. Andrews himself was a leading expert on the defense communication systems that failed on 9/11. And SAIC helped create the official account for what happened at the World Trade Center, both after 9/11 and after the 1993 bomb. And additionally, one of the SAIC managers actually managed the robots at Ground Zero, which had been used for elimination of unexploded ordnance in the past. So these things all give hints, and there are many more, that SAIC may have played a role in the attacks.
Let's talk about Dick Cheney, the man behind the man, I guess you could say. Everyone knows him, but what dirt do you have on Cheney? And what does the evidence point to his complicity in the events and subsequent cover-up?
Well, the one thing that most people have cited is the testimony of Secretary of Transportation Norman Mineta, which indicates that Dick Cheney, as vice president, was tracking one of the flights as it was approaching Washington. And that's surprising because the official report says there was no one who knew about Flight 77, which was the flight he was tracking, and he had issued orders about this flight some way. But also people should remember that Dick Cheney was the leading voice behind lies that have started several other wars, one of them being the Gulf War in 1990-91. He told several lies along with his partner Dwayne Andrews, and then he was behind the lies that started the Iraq War, the weapons of mass destruction, the claims that Saddam was associated with 9/11. So in between these obvious deceptions to start war was 9/11, Dick Cheney being in charge at the White House, ultimately doing nothing to protect us. Cheney also worked to obstruct and delay the investigation into 9/11, actively worked to prevent an investigation into 9/11. There are other things, including the continuity of government program, which I go into in my book, that I lead people, I think, to believe that Dick Cheney is a top suspect.
Well, I think, you know, when you're pointing out a lot of these players in your book, Kevin, a lot of them are members of the Project for a New American Century, that document that kind of says that this crew needed an event like a new Pearl Harbor in order to kind of enact that new hegemony around the world and that overtaking of Eurasia's resources and militarization. Kevin, what about people who say, you know, all of this is really fascinating, it's really interesting, all, however circumstantial, coincidental, all can be chalked up to ineptitude by the Bush administration to kind of have this event happen? They never expected it. What's your response to that?
Well, there are a few things that are not just circumstantial, but you're right. The circumstantial evidence is overwhelming, I would say. But in some cases, some of these suspects can be brought up on charges. For example, some of them were among those people who were associated with 9/11 insider trading, like Fort Walker, who's one of the suspects. Others lied directly to Congress, including Ralph Everhart, the commander of NORAD, and George Tenet, the director of the CIA. And that is, of course, against the law to lie to Congress. So there's circumstantial evidence, but there is more than that as well.
Right. And we have about a minute left, but I wanted you to touch upon the enterprise called the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. What is this, and why should we be concerned about it?
Well, BCCI was a known terrorism network that was shut down in the early 90s and then bought up by the United Arab Emirates. And people should know that Richard Clark, the leading counterterrorism expert in the United States, was basically a representative of the United Arab Emirates and had warned them on several occasions of CIA plans to stop al-Qaeda Osama bin Laden. So BCCI runs throughout the book as one of several themes. Paul Bremer, again, as with Kissinger Associates, had meetings with BCCI and refused to release the documents to the Senate investigation that covered that scandal.
Well, it's been called the world's sleaziest bank by Time magazine in the early 90s. Maybe we should be looking a lot more carefully at this entity. Kevin Ryan, amazing to have you on, co-editor of the Journal of 9/11 Studies.
Thank you.
Well, guys, that's it for tonight's show. See you back here to break the set again tomorrow.